Welcome back to our large group session. We want to make sure that we show you all what our program officer, lead queen of all things STEM, Tori was discussing this morning. So these are the overarching evaluative questions that we were discussing this morning in the session. And so if you want to take pictures of the slide, you're more than welcome to, of course. But we wanted to make sure that you were aware that these were the questions that were being discussed earlier today. Okay, I'll give you some time for that. Great. So we are super excited about this panel, right? And those of you who are like me who nerd out to certain voices and certain academics in this space, you're gonna nerd out to this panel. And I'm really, really excited about these voices, right? So the powerhouse of voices and academics that we have on this panel, we're going to start with Ann down at the end. So if you are not familiar with the work of Cassie and Ann Gates in her career, shame on you, okay? Shame on you. Like, just step it up, okay? But the work that Ann and Cassie do, to make sure, is definitely outlined in your program guide, which if you are old school like me, you haven't downloaded. But Cassie serves as a leading voice for the Computing Alliance community at Hispanic serving institutions. And the work that they do in making sure that there's an equal opportunity in science and engineering for those who are from Hispanic and Latino communities is just nationally renowned. Okay, so we are excited to have your contributions and your voice on this panel today, Dr. Gates, as she is one of the great minds in STEM that has been recognized in our country. So we thank you for that. And you can clap for that. That's definitely clappable. I'm not going to go to Faye's bio because I can speak from her bio off the top of my head. Dr. Faye Cobb-Payton, who will be facilitating this panel today, is a former program officer at National Science Foundation. And as I lovingly told someone last night, she is the reason BP and minority serving institutions in SICE have become more of a central figure in their work. She is, in my perspective, computer science BP. And the work that she has done in her career as a professor emeritus at NC State, as a former employee of IBM, is just absolutely incredible. And for her to facilitate our panel today, we're very honored that you would take the time out of all the work that you do and all the organizations you work with to help lead this conversation. And the paper that Ann and she wrote that just came out last week, if you haven't already downloaded it, please do so, because it also contributes to the voices in this space and the work that we are all doing. Our next panelist is super excited that we haven't actually connected yet, and I'm glad that we're going to soon. Okay? Make sure I got I apologize. There we go. So Dr. Timberly Rome of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina is doing some phenomenal work with our Native and Indigenous communities around the power of Indigenous knowledge and centering that knowledge in STEM. Her work, which is previously part of a 2018 Includes DLP, is now part of a much larger project around the native food engineering and water systems work that I mentioned this morning. If anyone was paying attention, you're welcome. Okay. And so we're really excited to be able to have her contributions to this conversation today around equity and systems change work. So thank you, Dr. Roan, for being here. And our last panelist, last but not least, if you are familiar with the work of QEM, you know that he is my predecessor. And as someone said earlier, oh, you're Ivory's replacement. I said, no, I'm kind of his enhancement, but that's okay. It's okay. Okay. I did say it. I mean, you know I did. But Ivory's the reason I'm at QEM, right? So I started at QEM as a faculty trainee and then served in working with as technical assistance support and then an evaluator. And so I'm honored, of course, to be able to walk into the footsteps of Ivory to do this work that we're doing at QEM, which was, of course, started by Shirley, who was a powerhouse in herself. But Ivory now serves as the National Director for the NAACP educational initiatives across the country. And if we're familiar with the great work that NAACP is doing, then you're very familiar as to why they snatched him up very, very quickly. To continue leading the conversation around equity in education, not just for STEM, which is where QEM typically focuses, but for all educational systems. And so we're very grateful to have Dr. Tolson with us today as part of this panel. Are you emeritus yet at Howard, or are you still a full professor at Howard? He's a full professor at Howard, that's right, in psychology. And so doing very, very great work in both organizations. Just didn't know. So again, we are super stoked about this panel. So I will turn it over to our facilitator. What did I miss? Okay, great. Nope. Oh, we do have announcements. So we are collecting some lost and found items here as well. So if any of these things look like they could be yours, please retrieve them. And then other.
Yep. So these folks are going to lead us through a great discussion. But as you're listening, one of the things I hope that you will think about is, how is it similar, dissimilar from where you are when you're thinking about change, systems change work? And they represent many different positions in it, right? Whether it may be from institutional top down, or whether it may be right middle or bottom up. Think about that as they share their experiences, and think about those similarities. So on that note, thank you very much.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Okay, I know this is after lunch, poor planning. But this is not the panel to sleep on, right? So we're gonna have part theory, part application, and all real talk, okay? So as Dr. Lynch mentioned, I am Faye Cobb-Payton. She gave you my background. I want to, first of all, say that systemic change cannot happen unless you acknowledge what's happened in the past. And to do that, the first thing I want to say is that in September 2022, the Includes convening that was held at Arizona State University around the NSF community convening took place. And there was a fantastic report out of that convening, for which sets the framework for this convening. The PIs of that convening were Ann Gates, Ilsa, Via, Goldstein, and Legg. I don't know if they're here, right? Are they here? I know. So that work, if you've not seen that work, I encourage you all to see that report, because that report actually informs the kinds of questions that we are talking about today. I had the privilege of being at NSF and being one of the program officers on the Includes project, the very first cohort of alliances that came out of this. So I want to say this, when Sylvia was talking this morning and she talked about all this buildup, the data collection, going to community. I was one of those people in a community. I was a faculty member, and I remember the urgency, because I remember Sylvia saying, well, can't you come back to the panel? And I said, no, I have a student final, and I think I better get to the final. But I want to say this, that this is about, as was mentioned earlier, about collective action, a collective impact. And part of that, and part of the reason for taking a look forward, you must look backwards. And so I wrote this piece in the Medium that really talks about what does it mean to look backwards in order to move forward. So with that, we came up with some questions around what are these collective minds doing in their environments around systemic change? What has the theory of change done? But now what's missing? Because we're in year almost 2024. And so in order to do that, we wanted to ask a couple of questions. Some of the questions, while they are scripted up here, may be modified just slightly, panelists, right? And so I want to give you this context before we get started. In the 2013-2014 CIOS report, if you have not gotten that report, I encourage you to get the report. NSF was challenged to undertake a leadership role among federal agencies. NSF was placed in the leadership role to create an agency-wide initiative to advance broadening participation efforts. With NSF at the lead, the response was, now what we have is the Eddie Bernice Johnson NSF Includes program that, wow, has been renamed since I stepped out of my role as an NSF program officer just last year. But to that, and according to that, that meant that anything at scale, organizations of all types advancing broadening participation to solve the broadening participation in STEM problem. As James Moore mentioned, it's just not a workforce issue. So if anybody's out there just working on this from a workforce issue, that is not the issue. It's bigger than just workforce and training people for current career goals and career jobs. It's really about national security. And so with that, we want to start off with the questions. If you put those back up for me, those would be great. If you could put that slide back up. So the first question. Okay, there you go. Thanks. So the first question that I'd like to ask the panelists is, in what ways and what extent has leveraging collaborative infrastructure to address broadening participation, how has it been a challenge? What's the challenge? Ivory, tell us. We'll start with you.
All right. Good afternoon. It's so great to be back in this space. I just came back from the NAACP National Convention in Boston, and it's a much different group, not as much fun as you all. Just kidding. I'm just kidding about that. They're a lot more fun.
Yeah.
So when I first entered the Includes Network, and this was 2016, this is when I just got to QEM, just came away from the White House as the executive director of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. And we had this opportunity as a QEM network to enter into this space of other similarly funded projects. And this is before we got involved with the hub. But it was this opportunity for us to join with these other projects that were funded under the same system, under a philosophy that the collective of our work would be better than our individual efforts. And the story sounded very good, but the implementation really never seemed to materialize. I think in that first year when we did the project, I'm not sure if we had any interactions with any of the other funded projects. And then a year or maybe two after that, we had the opportunity to be a part of the hub. And the hub created a better infrastructure to connect the projects. And so I think that was a huge leap forward, but we still never, are at that point, it took a while to really understand how you take this individual project and connect it with other projects and really create something much larger than you could on your own. And so the challenge, I think some of the challenges that created some barriers for this. One was our Western orientation into our work. We are an individualistic society. And I think we want to do the right thing, and we understand some of the philosophies of the indigenous community and African community. We understand, or some of us understand, Ubuntu and those types of things, but the infrastructure that we're operating in, the way that we have to present our work, the way that we have to demonstrate that we've done something good is still a Western orientation. And I also believe that not having the kind of discussions that we need to have about the Western influence of what we do and ignoring some of the contributions from other cultures, and also the appropriation of some of the language and the philosophies, collectivism, I mean, black people celebrate Kwanzaa, we were talking about collectivism growing up.
Right.
And, native cultures, indigenous cultures, they always talk about this. But yet, when we talk about what it means for our own work, we're often using researchers that don't look like the communities and the cultures where a lot of this originated and germinated. Another challenge, and I'll stop with this, but another challenge is that I think that when we think about broadening participation fundamentally is about others, not necessarily about ourselves. We want other people, other communities, not our own, other communities to be more involved in this space. And so we start to pontificate and talk in a certain way that we understand what we're saying, but the ones that we really need bought into our work, they don't really understand. Because if you are a senior at Ballou High School and you graduated in the top 20% of your class, but that still only gives you about a 3.2 GPA, and Howard University won't accept you with that. Georgetown isn't going to accept you with that. You have to understand what your opportunities are. Nobody there is going to say, I wish they had broadening participation. He or she is going to say, I wish they would give me a chance.
Yeah.
But when have we ever translated broadening participation to give me a chance? And so if we can talk in their language sometimes, how do we get people to give them a chance? These elite universities, how do we get us to give them a chance? So these are types of things we have to think about when we think about how we truly deliver on the promise of includes and collective impact.
All right. We have a lot to unpack that. But we're going to turn to you next, right? And then we'll get you in.
Okay, great. All right. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Timberly Roan. I'm joining you from the University of Colorado, Denver, but I, in 2018, was part of a DDLP called Environmental Stewardship of Indigenous Lands, and that is continuing to exist and runs sustainably, by the way. Yeah. Okay, and we are also part of the Native Fuse Alliance, so the Native Food, Energy, Water Systems Alliance. And so I join you here today representing both ESIL, E-S-I-L, and the Native Fuse Alliance. What's really interesting is when we wrote the ESIL grant proposal, we pushed collective impact, which is, collective impact's been around in a lot of our cultures, especially our indigenous cultures, for a long time, and it's weird to put that kind of a term to effectively working together, inclusively and equitably. But we used the term collective impact. But what was really interesting is this: we made a mistake. So we got the grant, we got everything started, we had external partners, we have institutional partners, federal partners, state partners, tribal partners, and we forgot perhaps the most important partner, and that was our students. We quickly learned that we needed to elevate the voice of our students, because the rest of us that are professionals and we've been brought up in this westernized educational system, yeah, we can figure out what's going on. But here we were trying to create programming for individuals who we had not actually reached out to figure out what it is they want. So the student voice now becomes really elevated in this. And that's continued through the Native Fuse Alliance as well. Our most important collaborations and partners are our students, because they're the ones that are experiencing the experience. And so while we can sit around the table, plan programs, be partners, and collaborate, if we don't have students sitting with us as equal partners in those discussions, we're not going to get anywhere. So some of the other things to consider. So one of the biggest challenges, though, and that includes including the student voice, is the time needed to build the relationships of trust. Mm-hmm. And that's so incredibly important. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to work at different levels. So the Native Fuse Alliance works at K through 12. We work at pre-collegiate and collegiate levels. We work at post-collegiate levels with career and workforce development. We work with faculty and faculty training. And so time is needed, though, to build the relationships to learn to trust each other. And that's really become critical both internally. We have to know to trust each other internally, but also externally as well. And that time needed, as was just mentioned, flies in the face of how funding agencies like to operate, our institutions like to operate, our respective agencies like to operate. So one of the biggest challenges is learning your partners. And why is that so important? The student narrative is a perfect example. You have to learn what your partners can bring to the table so you can leverage what they have to offer. Because no one group of us can do everything. And so you bring everyone to the table equitably. One of the other challenges that we have to really think about as we collaborate is that a lot of our students are really focused on place-based learning. And that also doesn't fit really well in our current sort of westernized system of training students. So one of the things we're really working on is how do we acknowledge this place-based need for our students. And so to do that, we're bringing in our TCUs, our indigenous communities themselves, and learning how we can provide these educational opportunities while these students stay home. And that's flexing now the institutions that are involved in the alliance as well, the westernized institutions that are involved. It's pushing our boundaries. How do we give credit for experiential credit when somebody is not physically on our campus and within our walls? So hopefully that just helps get the conversation started.
All right, thank you. Ann?
Thank you so much. Those your points that you made are really resonating with me and very much what I would be contributing to the conversation. CASI was formed in 2006 by the NSF Broadening Participation in Computing program. So we started with 6 institutions, and then moving to includes, the challenge was in that scaling. We moved from 6 to 80 institutions, 80 partnerships, and we brought in 2-year colleges. The big difference was collective impact. It really provided the framework for us to be able to do that. So that was a solution to this challenge of expanding very rapidly. Because we're Hispanic serving institutions, we are not monolithic. I mean, we go everywhere from California, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, in the north, New Jersey, New York, and Illinois. And those populations are very different. I mean, you go from Mexican American to Puerto Rican and Dominican Republic and all different, Cuban, there's all these different really demographics that we cover. And because of that, there's a context. I was in a group a little bit earlier, the affinity group, and we were talking about setting common agenda, because I'm going to say that was a challenge. It took us 1.5 years to come up with our common agenda. And people are often surprised when I say that. But the reason is because we needed to hear the voices of these different groups. We needed to hear the voice of the 2-year colleges. We needed to hear the voice of primarily maybe immigrant population that you're serving, first-gen population. Institutions that have different resources. Some are very low resource, some have high resources. We work now with R1 HSIs, and they are high resource. So coming up with that common vision, common mission, and then setting the goals takes time, because then that's how you build trust. So what we started with and what we ended with evolved over time. And so I think that the importance of perspectives, but also listening and acknowledging contributions is one of the hardest things I think that you face in being an alliance. As an institutions, we're highly competitive, right? You have to be first author, you can't really do interdisciplinary research. There's all these rules that are in place if you're tenure track. And so how do you move from that to a collective impact where you're really working for the common good of the alliance and for broadening participation? Takes the right partners. And so one of the things that we're really careful about in our alliance is making sure that the partners that are joining us, and we do get requests quite often, they have a period of time that they show that they truly are committed to our values, right? And so we don't just take people in, we invite them, we include them in our conversations, but then once we recognize that they are committed, we have them sign a memorandum of understanding saying that they will provide us with the data that we need to show progress, but that they will also adopt a high impact practice, a signature practice. And so I'll turn that back to you.
Okay, all right. So as you can see, we have a lot to unpack given the responses and the experiences that we've heard about, but also some of the language that we're hearing. I think the language is really important, right? So I want to start with this idea of collectivism, right? E.B. Du Bois would just, he was center in my home, right? And what does it mean to broaden participation? And you talked about the Western lens, the indigenous lens. And the question is, who gets to participate? Because, one of the questions we have up there is, what results in equitable systems change? You can change a system and it not be equitable. So, having said that, having understood what's happened with your alliance, you early on with both with the DDLPs, you with BPC in size, right? Who gets to participate? What has been the experience when it comes to who gets to participate, and how do you define equity in systems change? And we'll start with you.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah.
that's really tough. I already talked about, we really strive to provide people with shared values. I think it's so important to have the shared core values. It's really a question about, what is knowledge, what knowledge counts, and who can contribute to that knowledge. And I think that is so important. When I think of equity, I can look at it a couple of ways. Maybe something that you may not expect is I really look at it as, at an institution, how are you valuing research versus inclusive teaching and equitable learning? Are those equal? Are they equitable? Are you rewarded for the things that you do around broadening participation? The question is, in many of our institutions, that's not the case. And so equity for me is being at an institution that recognizes differential workload, and the value of broadening participation efforts. I also look at equity, as I said earlier, regarding who we're including. And I think Timberly talked about the student voice. And it's really, for me, it's hearing that voice and being able to listen to those voices. One thing is giving someone voice. Another thing is actually hearing that voice and then acting on it. And I think that if we're looking at equitable environments, we really have to think seriously around how we listen to others with different perspectives, and then how do we integrate that in the work that we do at an institution or organization.
Mm-hmm. Timberly?
Yeah, thank you. And so, I'll follow up with that directly. The student voice, again, continues to be hugely important in both ESOL, the DDLP, and the Native Fuse Alliance. but it extends beyond that too. So we always make sure that we have different avenues for students to contribute what they want to contribute. And we try to make sure we really provide a lot of different formats for those contributions. Self-identifying formats, non-anonymous formats, electronic formats, paper formats, in-person formats, etc. And then we act, and we try to share it back with the student group as a collective. We heard this from you, and this is what we're doing in response. Or, we heard this from you, we don't think we can do anything right now, but we're going to keep this on our list, and we're going to keep working on it. So there's that equity from that standpoint. Now, we also try to make sure we're equitable with our partners, because we do have resource variable partners. And so, again, we give lots of opportunity for voice. I'm going to be vulnerable and open here. One of the biggest challenges, and I'm going to speak from an ESOL standpoint on this, because I work most closely with our students. We struggle with trying to find the balance of accommodating the needs of our Indigenous identifying students and students who may not be Indigenous identifying. And that, for us, has turned out to really be an interesting challenge that we're still trying to figure out. I don't have answers to that yet. But to be open and transparent as we each are trying to create safe spaces, from what I've heard for a lot of our students in our different student groups, there is this acknowledgement and need for allies. And how do we bring them into our collective programs and do it in a way that it doesn't cause harm and that they have opportunities to learn themselves and to engage, and trying to figure out, like, what does that mean within the context of not only academic programming, but then if I extend it to a larger alliance with our partners and our community members. And recognizing, as Faye had brought up earlier, some of the previous harm that's been caused. And we can't escape that. We have to acknowledge that. And that inherently there can be a degree of mistrust in this entire process. And so that's something that, we need to acknowledge, and we have to work through and do it in a way as best we can to hear all of the voices that are coming forward.
Okay.
So I'll just add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ivory?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that we have to look back to go forward, and I thought about the Sankofa bird that's looking back and moving forward.
Yeah.
And so when I think about system change, and when I think about our own work, because it's phrased as your work, but it really is our work in my mind when it comes to systems change, because our equitable systems change, because I don't see it as a possibility that my work by itself could change the system. It has to be a collective effort, which is why we have the Includes network together. When we think about the worst system that we've had in the United States, which is slavery, and contrary to what Florida says, slavery was of no benefit to anyone, especially the Africans who were enslaved. Well, there was a book that I read last year, and it was by W.B. Du Bois, based on his dissertation research, that looked at how the system of slavery was unraveled. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times when we learn about the ending of slavery in the United States, we don't have a full grasp of Black people's contribution to slavery ending. And we don't really understand the process, really. We tend to think of it as this is something that was happening that was bad, and then we went to war for it to stop. But the reason why we went to war was because Africans and allies made slavery untenable. And that's why Abraham Lincoln said that if he could restore the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do it. Those were his words. And scholars have debated whether or not he really meant that, but he did say it. There's no debating that. And one of the things that Du Bois said in the book was that there are three fundamental reasons why white people would get on board to fight to end slavery. One was for moral and religious reasons. Two was for social reasons. Social reasons mostly had to do with slave insurrections and the idea that if you have this type of system, then it's going to implode. There's going to be social repercussions. And the third is economic. And so when I've thought about my own work or our work and thinking about how to get people on our side, I think about all those three different arguments. And a lot of times, because of the goodness of a lot of the people that's in this room, we tend to lead with the moral argument.
Yeah.
But the social, and especially the economic, can be more compelling to others. You know, when I think about these industries, these large multinational corporations that start these DEI initiatives, I don't believe they're doing it for moral reasons. I think they're doing it because of the demographic changes that's happening in the United States. And they don't believe that they could do good business and be profitable in the future and still have a racially homogenous population of workers. So these are all the things that I think about. So when it comes to what we do, and when it breaks down to us individually, when I think about the work of QEM and the work of Howard University or NAACP, it's fundamentally about disruption. Because if we thought about it as, I'm going to help these interns through QEM, I'm going to help these underrepresented faculty, I'm going to help these students at Howard. If we thought about it through that lens, we really wouldn't be changing the system. We would be helping to diversify a bit, but it's really about how you create change agents and how you disrupt the system one at a time to pick it apart. And collectively, that's how we get to equitable systems change.
So with that, so I have to add, I'm not asking the question now, I have a comment to that. I think part of the systems change imperative was basically what Ann and I saw, right? Includes is certainly one of the programs that's at the fore of doing broadening participation, DEI, whatever we want to call it, at scale in STEM. But you cannot expect change doing the same thing because the data has already shown the level of support, research, how many barriers we would have to overcome in order for there to be parity if we're doing it by the numbers for participation. So to that regard, we wrote this little paper, and that paper is some of what is discussed in these questions, but we really didn't set out to say it was about a moral imperative, because I happen to believe if it were about the moral imperative, we would have done it a long time ago. Fundamentally, I happen to think it's about economics. Maybe that's because of my dissertation training. But when we talk about systems change, there was one other panelist that was to be here, but he could not. So I want to give Overton's perspective on this and what is equity, because it somewhat aligns to what all of you have talked about, and then particularly how do you see an institution. And for him, he says that fundamentally there are two problems. One is institutional leadership, which is what you and I discussed. And secondly, the other problem is projects are viewed as revenue generating, not institutional transformative. So when they come through the door, it is seen as, what's that overhead rate? Right? I know NC State, what I was at, what's that overhead rate? And economically, you have to decide, is it worth that 62.5% off the top? Right? That's a question. And then even the partnerships that you can broker, is it your 55% comes off of mine, my 62%, your 35%, your 60%, we down to $20. But NSF wants systemic change, right? And so those are fundamental questions. And Overton says, as a possibility, this is one of the things that he says, as a potential remedy, because we're not here to just discuss what are the problems. I think we all know what the problems are, most of us. But we want to talk about solutioning. And the question becomes is, possible remedies. He says, where are the accountability measures? Who's accountable for the system's change? Where is the senior leadership? And I used to always point about this one when I was an NSF program officer. Don't tell me about your letters of support, because half of them were pre-written, somebody signed off, and then you call that equity because you may have a Hispanic serving institution, a HBCU or a TCU involved. That is not intentionality. That is not equity. And I define equity by what's in the budget. That's it. That's how I define equity. We can go all around the bush, not everything else. But equity is built in the budget, okay? And so to that, Overton says, he said, I'm gonna go to the leader's point. He said, new leadership has to really think about how it honors its commitment to PIs and senior personnel. Which brings up the question, he says, of what does it mean for funding agencies? And so Ann, right? While we gave some, there's this, you said it took 1.5 years to really get on par with their 5 elements to include, right? Everybody knows the 5 elements, right? And shared vision, right? Partnerships, goals, metrics, leadership, communication, sustainability at scale. So if it took you 1.5 years to get to the shared vision, and we got 4 others we got to go to, and you got 5 years. Be mindful, these are not NSF research projects. This is a cooperative agreement. That's different. And how'd you do it? Tell us. Because Overton is saying, I'm running out of time. I don't know where he is, but he's basically saying, I've started, and from time t equals 0, I'm already in the negative, right? That's a challenge.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that was done during the DDLP, so it was during the pilot, and we were transitioning. But we recognize if we don't hear from those that are going to be doing the work, because he's absolutely right, the includes, a lot of the work being done by includes is not being paid for. It's really people who are truly committed, faculty and staff who are truly committed to the work, are doing the work, because by the time you take the funds and take out overhead and all of that, you're down to nothing, really. That's why the 5 years is just really not enough. I just would make that statement, because it does take, so DDLP was 2 years, and then we went into becoming an includes, and then the includes is a 5-year project. And when you look at centers, when NSF funds centers, they typically run 10 years, right, at least. Usually that's the timeline given to a center. So how do we do it? It's just a lot of work. I mean, a lot of dedicated people putting in the time. So the design elements for collective impact, it's creating the backbone, and it's the continuous communication, which is one of the hardest. And then it's reinforcing activities. But the reinforcing activities, which is the partnerships, that really is something that you have to commit to, but I would argue that it's that you build a relationship with the industry partner or the nonprofit partner. You build the relationship not expecting any funding in return because you're building that trust and you're coming around common goals. And then if that trust is built and that you continue to make progress, then you'll start seeing a return on investment. But I don't know if I answered your question, but that's where, that's where we came from on that.
Okay, so you're cohort 1. So, Timberly, so tell us, you are cohort 3? 3. Cohort 3. The challenge of getting on that same page, the time of the project, because that's something that has come up, right? Time of the project versus what NSF is requiring you to do. How are you managing that? Because you admittedly said it has been a challenge when it comes to the students.
I don't have an answer.
Okay.
We're still working on it. And are we going to get everything accomplished that we're setting out to accomplish within the 5-year period? I have high hopes, and I have some colleagues sitting around here. But it's definitely requiring a heavy lift. And there are a lot of us putting in time that's uncompensated into the effort because we're passionate about it. Finding partners who have the same mission or belief, identifying that common goal really early on, if you can, has been an advantage for us. We haven't dealt with much difference across the goals of our partners. And then certainly identifying partners who will be bringing something. So finding out what their strengths are and allowing them to contribute in ways that play up to their strengths, not forcing them into categories of partners and saying, well, you have to do this because you're at this type of an institution. Figure out what their strengths are, and that will help as we build and work together. I will say this, and I want to go back to the DDLP. We started planning and building the relationships with our partners, both tribal partners and non-tribal partners, up to 2 years in advance of submitting that proposal. So as soon as the vision came out, we immediately started working on it and just hoped that there was a grant program that was going to fit the timing of our vision. We didn't cram our vision into a grant deadline. Okay, so I do put that out there. That's not easy to do. That is not something that's trivial, but that is something that we're engaging in as we think about ongoing funding for the program. And if I can take a moment and go back to one of your, Overton's comments and one of your comments about transformation and thinking about leadership and institutional leadership. One of the things that I'm challenging my institution, so I am only speaking for myself, my institution to do is I am challenging our administrators to engage in Indigenous activities. That is the best way that they're going to learn about our communities. I'm tired of going into this revolving door of administrators' offices and explaining the same thing over and over again. So I invite them to go into our cultures, our communities, and engage. And maybe that's something we can extend to funding agencies. I know there's a few NSF officers. I invite you, and I'm happy to partner with you on that effort, but something to think about there.
Okay, so can I change up for, I think we have about 10 minutes, 5 minutes or so. Ivory, I want to change up and ask you to really talk about when we're thinking about systemic change, is looking forward to Sankofa in order to move forward. So I remember the early days, right, of the DDLP, and we had very confidential discussion about, everybody uses the word belonging these days, right? Belonging. What did that mean for you in the earlier years, and how did QEM sort of overcome any challenges of belonging?
Yeah, so we were cohort 1 DDLP. One of the things that was good about our experience is that we had natural alliances built in with other minority serving institutions, institutions that we've worked with already. And so we felt like we had belonging within that space, but within the larger ecosystem. You know, a lot of the, you know, what you might consider power players, you know, they came out early as, you know, we are the alliances.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a certain way in which alliances, you know, if we're being honest and candid, certain ways in which alliances were treated at the larger convenings in contrast with the ones who had DDLPs and who had, you know, conferences that were funded. But yet we were all supposed to be working in this together. So that became kind of the quandary with that, and in many ways it probably replicates larger society.
Yes.
You know, where, and you know, it goes back to Western values where there's a certain elitism that can be attached to those who have gotten a larger grant, and that can play out in these spaces. And if you are, you know, new coming in, or if you have a smaller grant, if you have a smaller research portfolio, and I'm defining research in terms of those peer-reviewed publications, but you may have more experience working with students, but yet that may not be rewarded, you know, in a way that you would expect it to be rewarded. So in many ways that replicates your typical scientific conference, where those with even, you know, maybe somewhat meaningless research, as long as it's been published widely, they get elevated to a certain status, and those who may not have had time are the networks to get into certain journals, but they have worked with so many students and changed so many lives and have done a lot more to change the system outside of the ivory tower, may not be getting the just due. Ending on a high note, when we were asked to participate in the Includes Hub, as a smaller organization, and you know, being with all of these organizations that had, you know, $100 million operating budget and hundreds of staff members, and QEM with a staff of about 7 at the time, for us to be invited in that space and be able to meaningfully contribute, be heard by everyone in that group, and come out successful in terms of winning that award. I think that was a pivotal time for QEM, and I think a model of how we can push beyond some of these boundaries.
Okay. All right. Well, that's our panel. I just have just a few things just to summarize, right? We heard a lot about unpacking meaning. What does broadening participation means and who gets to participate? We heard a lot about building trust and what does that mean to be intentional. The historical perspective, I'd be remiss without plugging the National Academy's Anti-Racism in STEM report, because it does align. Chapter 1 is the historical context. So if you've not read it, please download it and take a look at it. But overall, what we heard is, what is equity? And how are you defining equity and pushing equity, or not? While you might think that you are, but how are there other ways that you can do that? And lastly, want to say that we're going to end on a note that leadership matters, and continuity of leaders of what's happening on your campuses and in your organizations, because as Overton said, they're looking for the overhead rate. But you're trying to do work that's transformative in a short window with a shorter funding cycle. So lots to think about in terms of systemic change, and want to thank the organizers for inviting us to be here as the panel. Thank you.